The workshop fell silent except for the steady tick-tick-tick of something that hadn't worked in years. Tony's weathered hands held the pocket watch like it was made of crystal, and for the first time in decades, the hardest man in Block C was crying. Anthony Tony Castellano had been counting his days at Riverside Federal Correctional for exactly 847 days. Not because he was eager for release, he still had 14 months remaining on his sentence for tax evasion and failure to report income. He counted because precision mattered. In his previous life, precision had sent rockets to Mars and brought them home safely. Now it helped him survive in a world where a single miscalculation could cost you everything. At 52, Tony looked older than his years. Prison had a way of accelerating time, adding lines to faces and weight to shoulders that had nothing to do with physical labor. His salt and pepper hair had gone completely gray during his incarceration, and his once soft hands now bore the calluses of someone who had learned to work with them in ways he never expected. But his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing, analyzing everything with the systematic approach of someone who had spent 3 decades solving problems that existed at the intersection of physics and impossibility. Tony's crime had been almost laughably simple compared to the complexities of his former work. As a senior aerospace engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, he had designed guidance systems for spacecraft that traveled billions of miles through the vacuum of space. But when his wife's cancer treatments bankrupted their family, he had started a small consulting business on the side, helping private aerospace companies with technical problems. The income was substantial, and in his desperation to pay mounting medical bills, he had failed to report it properly to the IRS. The investigation had been thorough and unforgiving. 3 years of unreported income, hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes and penalties, and a judge who believed that educated professionals should be held to higher standards. The investigation had been thorough and unforgiving. 3 years of unreported income, hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes and penalties, and a judge who believed that educated professionals should be held to higher standards. Tony had accepted his sentence without complaint, understanding that his choices had consequences even when his motivations had been pure. What he hadn't expected was how difficult it would be to find purpose in a place designed to strip away every aspect of your former identity. The workshop at Riverside was supposed to be for vocational training, teaching inmates basic skills they could use upon release. Most of the equipment was old, broken, or both. Industrial sewing machines with seized gears, computers from the 1990s that barely functioned, and hand tools that had seen better decades. The supervisor, a tired man named Collins who had worked in corrections for 20 years, mostly let the inmates tinker with whatever held their interest as long as they stayed out of trouble. Tony found the workshop by accident during his second week inside. He had been wandering the corridors during recreational time, trying to find a space where he could think quietly, when he heard the familiar sound of mechanical frustration coming from behind a partially open door. Someone was trying to fix something and failing, judging by the muttered curses and sounds of metal hitting metal. Inside, he found a young inmate named Marcus struggling with an old radio that had clearly seen better days. The back panel was off, revealing a tangle of wires and components that looked like they had been randomly rearranged by someone with no understanding of electrical circuits. Marcus was poking at the mess with a screwdriver, his face scrunched in concentration and growing frustration. "That's not going to work," Tony said quietly from the doorway. Marcus looked up, annoyance flashing across his face. "Yeah? You think you can do better, old man?" There was challenge in his voice, the automatic hostility that governed most interactions between inmates who didn't know each other. Tony shrugged and stepped into the workshop. "Mind if I take a look?" What Tony saw when he examined the radio was immediately familiar to him, not the specific device but the problem-solving process it represented. Someone had attempted repairs without understanding the underlying system, creating new problems while trying to solve the original one. It was the same principle he had encountered countless times in spacecraft design. When you don't understand how something works, your attempts to fix it usually make it worse. Tony spent the next 2 hours carefully tracing circuits, testing connections, and explaining to Marcus what each component did and why it mattered. He worked with the patience of someone who understood that lasting solutions required understanding, not just quick fixes. When the radio finally crackled to life and began playing music from a local station, Marcus's face lit up with amazement and something that looked like gratitude. "How did you know how to do that?" Marcus asked, staring at the radio like it had performed magic. Tony considered the question carefully. How much of his background did he want to reveal? In prison, information was currency, and currency could be used against you. But something in Marcus's genuine curiosity made him decide to take the risk. "I used to fix more complicated things than radios," he said simply. Word spread through the cell block with the speed that only gossip could achieve in a closed environment. The new guy in cell 24/7 could fix electronics. Within a week, Tony found himself with a steady stream of inmates bringing him their broken possessions. Radios, headphones, small fans, digital watches, anything with circuits that had stopped working. He accepted everything they brought him, never asking for payment, never promising miracles, just offering to see what could be done. The workshop became Tony's sanctuary. Collins, recognizing that Tony's presence actually improved productivity and reduced conflicts among the inmates who used the space, gave him increasingly free access to tools and components. Tony established a systematic approach to the repair requests, documenting what he worked on, what parts he needed, and what techniques proved most effective. It was the closest thing to real engineering work he had experienced since his arrest. But more than that, Tony discovered that fixing things had become a form of meditation for him. Each broken device was a puzzle with a solution, a problem that could be approached methodically and resolved through patience and understanding. In a world where so many problems seemed insurmountable, his wife's death, his financial ruin, his lost career, these small victories provided a sense of accomplishment and purpose that he hadn't felt in months. The inmates who brought him their broken belongings came from every corner of the prison's social hierarchy. Drug dealers, armed robbers, white-collar criminals like himself. Their crimes didn't matter when their radios stopped working or their fans broke down during the summer heat. Tony treated everyone's requests with the same careful attention, understanding that these small possessions often represented the only connection these men had to comfort, entertainment, or normalcy. But Tony's growing reputation also attracted attention from quarters that were less benign. Crusher Williams had been the undisputed king of Block C for over 3 years. At 6'3" and built like the professional athlete he had once been, Crusher ruled through a combination of physical intimidation and economic control. He ran gambling operations, managed drug distribution, and took a percentage of any significant transaction that occurred within his territory. The idea that someone was providing valuable services for free was not just unusual, it was a threat to his business model. Crusher had earned his nickname in the boxing ring, where his devastating left hook had ended 17 professional fights before a drug conviction ended his career and landed him in federal prison. Behind bars, he had transferred his competitive instincts from athletics to criminal enterprise, building an organization that controlled most of the contraband trade in Block C. His crew of loyal followers treated him with the kind of desperate loyalty that comes from knowing that crossing Crusher meant becoming his next victim. The first time Crusher noticed Tony's repair work was when one of his crew members, a wiry man named Snake, brought a broken digital watch to the workshop. The watch was expensive, clearly not something an inmate should have been able to afford on prison wages. But Tony didn't ask questions. He simply examined the device, identified a loose connection in the battery compartment, and had it working again in less than 10 minutes. When Snake returned to report that the old dude in the workshop had fixed his watch without asking for anything in return, Crusher's interest was immediately piqued. In his experience, people who provided valuable services without demanding payment were either incredibly stupid or incredibly dangerous. Either way, they required investigation. Crusher decided it was time to meet this mysterious mechanic and determine which category he fell into. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon when Tony was deep in concentration, working on a small television that someone had dropped, cracking the circuit board inside. He was using a magnifying glass to examine hairline fractures in the printed circuits when Crusher's massive shadow fell across his work table. Tony looked up to find himself face to face with the most dangerous man in Block C. "You must be the fix-it man I've been hearing about," Crusher said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Tony set down his tools and straightened in his chair, meeting Crusher's gaze directly. "I help people repair their things, if that's what you mean." The response was calm, factual, without any trace of the deference that Crusher usually received from other inmates. "Help people," Crusher repeated, his tone suggesting that the concept was foreign to him. "That's interesting. See, in my experience, when someone provides valuable services, they expect something in return. Payment, favors, protection, something. But you're just giving away expertise that people would pay good money for on the outside. Makes me curious about your motivations." Tony considered his response carefully. He could sense the potential for conflict in Crusher's tone, but he also recognized that this conversation would determine how much freedom he would have to continue his work. "I fix things because they're broken," he said simply. "It's what I know how to do. If people want to pay me, they can. If they can't, that's fine too. Everyone deserves to have their belongings work properly." Crusher's eyebrows rose slightly. The answer was either refreshingly honest or dangerously naive, and he wasn't sure which. That's a noble sentiment, he said, settling into a chair across from Tony's work table. But nobility doesn't pay the bills in here. What you're doing, providing free services that people value, it disrupts the economic ecosystem I've spent years building. People start expecting handouts, charity, help without cost. That's not how the real world works. Tony nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Crusher's business perspective seriously. I understand your concern, but I'm not trying to compete with your operations. I'm just fixing broken electronics. If you'd prefer that I charge for my services, I could probably arrange something. Though I should mention that most of the people who come to me don't have much money to spend. The reasonable tone of the response surprised Crusher, who had expected either submission or defiance. Maybe we can work something out, Crusher said, his tone shifting to what he probably thought was friendly negotiation. You provide the technical expertise, I provide the business management. We split the profits 50-50 and everyone wins. You get protection, a steady income, and the freedom to keep doing what you enjoy. I get a new revenue stream and the satisfaction of knowing that Block C's economy stays properly regulated. Tony was quiet for a long moment, understanding that his response would have consequences that extended far beyond this conversation. Accepting Crusher's offer would provide him with protection and status, but it would also make him complicit in a system that exploited people who had very little to begin with. Refusing the offer would likely make him a target, but it would allow him to maintain the principles that had guided him throughout his career and his life. I appreciate the offer, Tony said finally, but I think I'd prefer to continue working the way I have been. I don't need protection, and I don't need income from this work. I just want to help people fix their things. The rejection was delivered politely but firmly, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. Crusher's friendly demeanor evaporated immediately. I don't think you understand the situation you're in, old man. This isn't a request. This is me being generous and offering you a chance to be part of the solution instead of becoming part of the problem. If you continue operating outside my system, you're going to discover that life in Block C can become very unpleasant very quickly. Tony met Crusher's threatening gaze without flinching. I understand your position perfectly, but my answer remains the same. I'm not interested in your business arrangement. The calm certainty in his voice seemed to surprise Crusher, who was accustomed to inmates either cowering before his threats or responding with bravado that masked fear. This was neither. This was simply a man stating his position with the confidence of someone who had made peace with the consequences of his choices. Crusher stood slowly, his movement deliberate and threatening. You've got 48 hours to reconsider. After that, I start making your life difficult in ways you can't imagine. And if you think the guards are going to protect some old-timer who thinks he's too good to play by the rules, you're about to learn how wrong you are. He turned and walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. By the way, that repair work you're doing, anyone brings you something to fix, you tell them to take it to someone who understands how business works in here. After Crusher left, Tony sat quietly in the workshop, staring at the broken television he had been working on. The threat was real and serious. Crusher had the power and willingness to make his life miserable, possibly even dangerous. But something about the man's approach had reminded Tony of problems he had faced throughout his engineering career. Bullies who used their position to force solutions instead of finding them. People who believed that power was more important than competence, systems that prioritize control over effectiveness. Tony had dealt with similar personalities in corporate boardrooms and government agencies, people who thought that intimidation was a substitute for expertise. They usually shared certain characteristics. They were successful in the short term, they demanded submission rather than collaboration, and they invariably made mistakes when faced with problems that couldn't be solved through force. The question was whether Crusher would prove to have the same vulnerabilities as his corporate counterparts. The next morning, despite Crusher's ultimatum, Tony returned to the workshop as usual. Within an hour, he had 3 people waiting with broken electronics, including Marcus with another radio that had stopped working. Tony accepted their requests calmly, as if nothing had changed, though he could feel the nervous energy radiating from the inmates who had heard about his confrontation with Crusher. "You sure about this, Tony?" Marcus asked quietly. "Crusher isn't someone you want to mess with. He's put people in the hospital for a lot less than what you're doing." Tony looked up from the radio he was examining. "I'm sure," he said simply. "Sometimes you have to decide what's more important, doing the right thing or doing the safe thing. I've already made my choice." Word of Tony's defiance spread through Block C faster than any official announcement could have reached every cell. Inmates began to choose sides, some admiring Tony's courage while others predicted his swift and violent downfall. The guards noticed the increased tension but couldn't identify its source, adding an extra layer of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. Crusher's retaliation began small but escalated quickly. Tony's dinner portions became noticeably smaller. His mail was delayed or mysteriously lost. His cell was searched repeatedly for contraband that was never found. The guards, either on Crusher's payroll or simply preferring to maintain the status quo, found reasons to make Tony's life more difficult without openly violating regulations. But Tony continued his repair work, and people continued to bring him their broken possessions. If anything, Crusher's pressure tactics seemed to increase Tony's determination to maintain his independence. He worked with the same methodical patience he had always employed, treating each repair request with the same careful attention regardless of the personal cost he was paying for his defiance. The breaking point came exactly 1 week after Crusher's ultimatum expired. Tony was working late in the workshop, trying to diagnose a problem with a small fan that one of the older inmates used to stay cool in his cell, when Crusher appeared in the doorway flanked by 3 of his enforcers. The workshop was empty except for Tony, and the isolation felt deliberately orchestrated. "I gave you a chance to do this the easy way," Crusher said, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had run out of patience. "Now we do it the hard way." His crew began moving into the workshop, spreading out to block any potential escape routes. Tony set down his tools and stood slowly, understanding that the moment he had been dreading had finally arrived. But before anyone could move further, Crusher's attention was caught by something on Tony's work table. Among the various electronic components and repair tools was a pocket watch that someone had brought in earlier that day. It was an antique piece, clearly old and valuable, with intricate engravings on its gold case. The watch face was cracked and the hands had stopped moving, but even broken, it was obviously a family heirloom of significant sentimental value. "Where did you get that?" Crusher asked, his voice suddenly different, quieter, with an undertone that Tony couldn't immediately identify. "Someone brought it in for repair. The mainspring is broken and there's damage to the escapement mechanism. It's repairable, but it will take time and some specialized tools I don't have access to here." Tony's response was automatic, professional, the same explanation he would have given to any customer about any complex repair. Crusher stepped closer to the table, his earlier threatening demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. He reached out tentatively, as if afraid the watch might disappear if he moved too quickly, then picked it up with surprising gentleness. His large scarred hands held the delicate timepiece like it was made of spun glass, and for the first time since Tony had known him, Crusher looked vulnerable. "This belonged to my grandfather," Crusher said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He gave it to me when I was 12, the day before he died. Told me it had been in our family for over 100 years, passed down from father to son. I've carried it with me everywhere, even in here, even though it stopped working years ago. I brought it to you 3 weeks ago, but I was too proud to ask for help directly. Had one of my guys drop it off and pretend it was his." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a fire, changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Tony looked at Crusher, really looked at him, and saw not the prison king who ruled through fear and violence, but a man who had carried a broken connection to his family for years, too proud or too afraid to admit that he needed help fixing something precious that he couldn't repair himself. "I can fix it," Tony said simply. "It will take me a few days and I'll need to fabricate some parts, but the damage isn't beyond repair. Your grandfather's watch can tick again." Crusher stared at Tony for a long moment, as if trying to understand how someone he had been prepared to hurt could offer such casual kindness in return for threats and intimidation. "Why?" Crusher asked finally. "After everything I've put you through, after all the threats and pressure, why would you help me?" Tony considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would determine not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but the future relationship between them and possibly the entire culture of Block C. "Because fixing things is what I do," Tony said simply. "I don't fix radios for good people and refuse to fix them for bad people. I don't repair televisions for inmates I like and ignore broken fans owned by people who threaten me. I fix things because they're broken, and broken things deserve to work again. Your watch is broken, I can fix it. That's all that matters to me." The simplicity and honesty of the response seemed to hit Crusher like a physical blow. He was accustomed to operating in a world where every action had ulterior motives, where kindness was always a manipulation, where help came with strings attached. Tony was offering to repair his most precious possessions simply because that's what Tony did. He fixed broken things. No conditions, no payment required, no leverage sought, just a craftsman willing to help restore something valuable that time and neglect had damaged. Crusher's crew watched in amazement as their leader's aggressive posture slowly crumbled. The man who had terrorized Block C for years was staring at a broken pocket watch with tears in his eyes, remembering a grandfather who had believed that some things were worth preserving, worth passing down, worth fixing when they broke. The watch represented everything Crusher had lost: family, continuity, connection to something larger than the violence and desperation that had defined his adult life. "My grandfather was a mechanic," Crusher said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Worked on cars his whole life. Had a garage in Detroit where people brought him everything from Model Ts to modern muscle cars. He could fix anything, make any engine run smooth, take something that was completely dead and bring it back to life. He used to tell me that everything deserved a second chance, that nothing was ever truly broken beyond repair if you understood how it was supposed to work." Tony nodded slowly, recognizing the philosophy he had inherited from his own mentors and teachers. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. The best mechanics understand that fixing things isn't just about technical skill. It's about believing that everything has value even when it's not working the way it's supposed to." The observation seemed to resonate deeply with Crusher, who had spent years forgetting the lessons his grandfather had tried to teach him. "He died when I was 13, Crusher continued, lost in memories. "After that, everything went wrong. My mom couldn't handle raising me alone, started drinking, bringing home men who weren't any good. I got angry, started fighting, ended up on the street by the time I was 16. Boxing was supposed to save me, give me direction, but when the money started coming in, I got involved with the wrong people. Drugs, gambling, worse things. Every choice I made took me further away from the man my grandfather wanted me to become." Tony listened without judgment, understanding that Crusher was sharing more than just his personal history. He was explaining how someone raised by a man who believed in fixing things had become someone who specialized in breaking them. It was a story Tony had heard variations of throughout his career. Brilliant people who had lost their way, talented individuals whose potential had been buried under poor choices and difficult circumstances. "But you still carried his watch," Tony observed quietly. "Even when it stopped working, even through all the years and all the mistakes, you kept it with you. That tells me something about who you really are underneath all the rest." Crusher looked down at the timepiece in his hands, seeing it not just as a broken mechanism, but as a symbol of paths not taken, lessons not learned, potential not realized. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation simultaneously. Crusher had built his power on fear, intimidation, and exploitation. But Tony was suggesting that real power, the kind his grandfather would have respected, came from building things up, not tearing them down. It was a fundamental shift in perspective that would require Crusher to reimagine everything about how he operated and what he wanted to achieve. Over the following weeks, as Tony worked on the intricate repair of the pocket watch, an extraordinary transformation began to take place in Block C. Crusher didn't abandon his position as the leader of his crew, but he started using his influence differently. Instead of extracting tribute from other inmates, he began protecting Tony's repair work, ensuring that anyone who wanted something fixed could bring it to the workshop without fear of retribution. The change wasn't immediate or complete. Crusher still had a temper, still commanded respect through his physical presence, still operated businesses that existed in the gray areas of prison regulations. But he also started bringing Tony more complex repair projects, things that other inmates had given up on, valuable items that people thought were beyond salvation. Each successful repair became a small victory, a proof that things could be restored, that damage didn't have to be permanent. Tony discovered that working on the pocket watch required him to develop new skills and techniques. The precision required was beyond anything in his aerospace experience. The tolerances were smaller, the mechanisms more delicate, the margin for error almost non-existent. But each evening, as he carefully adjusted gears and springs with improvised tools, he found a meditative satisfaction that reminded him why he had become an engineer in the first place. The other inmates noticed the change in their leader and began to adapt accordingly. The workshop became busier as more people brought repair requests, but it also became more collaborative. Inmates started helping each other with projects, sharing tools and knowledge, creating a community focused on restoration rather than destruction. The skills Tony taught began to spread as people learned basic electronics repair, mechanical troubleshooting, and problem-solving techniques. Collins, the workshop supervisor, was amazed by the transformation. What had been a space where inmates killed time and occasionally learned basic skills had become a genuine educational environment where complex technical knowledge was being shared and developed. He began requisitioning better tools and materials, understanding that what was happening in his workshop was exactly what the prison's rehabilitation programs were supposed to achieve. 3 months after their confrontation, Tony finally completed the repair of Crusher's grandfather's pocket watch. The crystal had been replaced, the case polished, The movement completely rebuilt with a combination of original parts and components Tony had painstakingly fabricated in the workshop. When he wound the mainspring and listened to the steady tick-tick-tick of the mechanism, Tony felt the satisfaction that only comes from solving a problem that seemed impossible when you started. The presentation ceremony was simple but profound. Tony called Crusher to the workshop during evening recreation and placed the restored timepiece on the table between them. The watch gleamed like new, its hands moving smoothly around the face, keeping perfect time for the first time in years. Crusher picked it up with trembling hands, holding it to his ear to hear the steady rhythm that connected him to his grandfather's memory. "I can't believe it actually works," Crusher said, his voice choked with emotion. "It's exactly like it was when my grandfather gave it to me. Even the engravings look new." Tony smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from completing a challenging project successfully. It was built to last. It just needed someone to understand how all the pieces were supposed to work together. Crusher looked up from the watch, meeting Tony's eyes directly. "I understand more than you know. This isn't just about fixing a timepiece, is it? It's about proving that things can be restored, that damage doesn't have to be permanent, that people can change if they have the right help and enough time." Tony nodded slowly, pleased that Crusher had understood the deeper lesson embedded in the repair process. "Your grandfather would be proud," Tony said quietly, "not just of the watch but of what you've become while it was being fixed. You've used these months to rebuild something more important than a mechanical device. You've started rebuilding yourself." The observation was accurate. Crusher had indeed changed dramatically over the course of the repair project, transforming from a predator into someone who protected and encouraged the constructive work happening in the workshop. 6 months later, when Tony was released from Riverside, he left behind more than just a successful repair business. He had helped create a culture where broken things were viewed as fixable, where people with technical knowledge shared it freely, where the most powerful inmate in the block used his influence to protect and encourage restoration rather than exploitation. The workshop had become the heart of a rehabilitation program that actually rehabilitated, changing lives through the simple act of teaching people that everything deserves a second chance. Crusher served another 2 years after Tony's release, but he spent that time differently than he had spent the previous 3. He continued to lead, but he led by example, showing other inmates that real strength came from building things up rather than tearing them down. He learned basic electronics repair himself, becoming one of Tony's most successful students, able to handle simple projects and teach others the fundamentals of troubleshooting and problem solving. The pocket watch became more than just a family heirloom. It became a symbol of transformation and possibility. Crusher carried it with him every day, checking the time regularly, but also listening to its steady rhythm as a reminder that even the most damaged things could be restored to their intended function with patience, skill, and care. When inmates asked him about the watch, he would tell them the story of how a quiet engineer had taught him that nothing was ever truly broken beyond repair. When Crusher was finally released, he returned to Detroit and opened a small electronics repair shop in the neighborhood where his grandfather had once worked on cars. He used the skills Tony had taught him, combined with the business acumen he had developed in prison, to create something legitimate and valuable. But more than that, he hired other formerly incarcerated individuals, teaching them the same lesson Tony had taught him, that everyone deserves a chance to fix what's broken, whether it's a machine or a life. Tony continued his work on the outside, volunteering at halfway houses and re-entry programs, teaching technical skills to people who needed second chances. He never forgot the lesson he had learned at Riverside, that the most important repairs weren't always the ones you could see, that fixing someone's radio might be the first step toward fixing their relationship with hope, and that teaching someone to solve technical problems could also teach them that life's problems might be solvable too. 5 years after his release, Tony received a letter from Crusher containing a photograph of a young boy, Crusher's nephew, holding the restored pocket watch and grinning proudly. "Teaching him what my grandfather tried to teach me," Crusher had written, "that everything deserves care, everything can be fixed, and the best way to honor the past is to build something better for the future. Thank you for showing me how to be the mechanic my grandfather wanted me to become." Tony kept that letter on his workbench, a reminder that the most important thing he had ever fixed hadn't been a spacecraft or a satellite or even an antique pocket watch. It had been the connection between a man and his family's legacy, the relationship between someone's past and their potential future. Because sometimes the most broken things are the ones you can't see, and sometimes the most important repairs are the ones that happen in the human heart. Nothing is ever truly broken beyond repair. Sometimes it just takes the right hands, enough patience, and the faith to believe that everything and everyone deserves to work the way they were originally designed. Whether it's a watch, a radio, or a life that's lost its way, The principles remain the same. Understand how it's supposed to function, identify what's preventing it from working properly, and carefully, methodically, lovingly restore it to its intended purpose.